Worry not, Tiger fans, because Missouri football absolutely crushed the transfer portal.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I want to talk about how Dennis Gates has given Missouri fans what a lot of them wanted anyway, a shorter rotation, but that does mean there's a trade-off. There is going to have to be some patience for some members of this roster and the Missouri fan base too. But you know what, before I start the program, I do want to remind you that from big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I want to start, of course, by talking about Mizzou football here because, of course, the way the transfer portal started off for Missouri, a lot of fans were worried when Williams Nwaneri and Kejuan Lacey, Jalen Brown, and other vaunted true freshmen, Courtney Crutchfield, the wide receiver from Arkansas, who is now back with Arkansas, by the way, back in his home state. He's signed with Arkansas after a one-year sojourn with the Missouri Tigers. Same with Kejuan Lacey. I would say he was assumed to be an Ole Miss signing right up until signing day, maybe an hour before signing day, that type of deal, when suddenly, apparently, I think fair to say that maybe an enticing offer came in at the final hour there for Kejuan Lacey that he took and, spent, again, a year in Missouri after ending up, guess where? Not a huge surprise here, at Ole Miss. So obviously some Missouri fans, there was a lot of consternation. I even had some people saying, something smells, something stinks here inside of the program. But as I pointed out here last week, really those true freshmen that I just mentioned, those four guys plus Jaron Sensabaugh, really the only five departures who ended up landing at another Power 4 program. So five guys who definitely have a lot of potential. But Eli Drinkwitz, as he said, right now he's valuing production over potential. And what Missouri has brought in is 14 guys, actually make it 15 now with their latest commitment, 15 guys who I think Missouri reasonably expects to compete for spots, at the very least at the 2 deep. I would say starters also competing for playing time at the very least. You look at the guys who Missouri took in the portal last season, almost all of them played a fairly significant role. So I would expect nothing less this time around. And speaking of making it now 15, that 15th man is Vince Brown, tight end from Colorado State. At this point in the process, I'm not sure that Vince Brown is going to be a huge part of the Missouri passing game next season, but I'd say safe to say he's probably a strong blocker based on Eli Drinkwitz's own preferences for tight ends and just how he likes to use them basically as a sixth offensive lineman at times in the running game. Brett Norfleet, hopefully with a healthy season, maybe a more healthy season in 2025, we'll maybe see that big passing game breakout that I was waiting for in 2024. But with Vince Brown now in the fold, just in case you think my, somewhat, I'll give it to you, a little fuzzy math there when I say, hey, 15-5, 15 additions and 5 departures that Missouri, really cared about. I would say 5 guys that ended up at power programs that you would have expected to compete for playing time next season. Well, let's take a step back. Let's compare this to the rest of the country. And if you look at On3's industry transfer portal rankings, you look at just the SEC and who is at the very top, it's none other than your Missouri Tigers. That's right, not near the top. No, they are literally number 1 in the SEC, according to On3. Now, interestingly here, who's dead last? none other than the Alabama Crimson Tide. So while I know the first season in Tuscaloosa for Kalen DeBoer didn't go as expected for Alabama fans, didn't live up to the lofty expectations that Nick Saban has raised that program to. I would also point out that Georgia is 13th in these rankings as well. Texas is 10th. What does that tell you to some extent? Well, it tells you that obviously the teams at the very tippy top of college football are going to have a little bit less that they need to go after in the transfer portal. Their needs in the portal are not going to be as great. And plus, those second string, third string guys at programs like Alabama and Georgia are obviously quite talented. Guys like Darius Smith, who transferred to Missouri this past season only to tear his ACL, unfortunately, in fall camp. Hopefully Smith will be a part of this pass rushing unit for the Tigers this coming fall. But the point here is that for all of the talk about, hey, who are the actual net winners from the transfer portal? And I've definitely had a lot of my fellow SEC squad mates pointing out that, the teams who are winning still, the teams that it's Ohio State and Notre Dame and Penn State, just look at the college football playoff. With the exception of SMU, I suppose, every single team in there could be considered a traditional college football power to one extent or another. So is it true that, we're going to see NFL-like parity in college football? Listen, I definitely wouldn't go that far with it, but I think when you look at the national rankings, again, I said Missouri is number one in the portal, at least according to On3 in the SEC. Well, how about nationally? Well, the Tigers are actually second nationally, to give you even more context. Number one, the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Also, interestingly, number 7, Rutgers, the Scarlet Knights as well. Otherwise, you're looking at a whole bunch of mainly traditional powers here. The point here is in bringing up those 3 teams specifically. To me, Missouri, Texas Tech, Rutgers. What do they all have in common? Well, none of those 3 teams and programs would be considered traditional powers in college football. But what they are is they are in the power conference. In the case of Missouri and Rutgers, obviously the 2 power conferences. But hey, apparently in Texas Tech's case, that landman oil money is finally starting to trickle down to Texas Tech and the Red Raiders. But back to my original point, who are the net winners here? It's not necessarily Alabama and Georgia, because they were already the big winners. And I'm not saying that suddenly Alabama and Georgia are going to be right on the same equal playing field with everybody else in the SEC. That would be ridiculous. But again, who has benefited from this current system versus the old system? To me, it's quite clear that Missouri is one of them. That obviously Texas Tech is one of them, at least in this cycle. And a team like Ole Miss, a team like Miami, Florida, that is the term sleeping giant, I think, in college football gets overrated. But in terms of Miami, I think that's very much an appropriate use of that term. So a team like Miami, a program like Miami that obviously has a lot going for it, was maybe just underneath obviously not at the level that it used to be. A team like Missouri that has had success in the past but never sustained it at a long enough level to be considered a blue blood, to make it an obvious statement. To me, it's obvious who the net winners are from the portal, and Missouri is one of the biggest of all. And by the way, Missouri is still hosting some really intriguing and top portal candidates still late here in the process as well. So really the only negative response I think you can have at this point is the classic, well, show me. Let's see what they really look like on the field next season. Hey, fair enough. I can't ever argue with actual results, but you could say the same thing about the departures as well. None of those 5 players in particular that I highlighted were truly proven players as far as, hey, every week starters in the SEC or anything like that. So if you're going to throw show me at you, I can throw show me right back at you in terms of the departures versus the addition. So bottom line, no reason to panic if you're a Missouri fan in the portal. In fact, it's quite opposite. Quite the opposite. There's plenty of reason to celebrate right now. So basically, people need to get over the idea that Missouri is having a problem here in the portal and football. I also think people need to get over, on the basketball side of things, the 0-19 season for Dennis Gates. I know I have. So let's talk more about that and some more basketball here on the program. But first, a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes used to be dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating times, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Well, now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched up to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed. And while you go about your day, there'll be no stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. I get the feeling that most Missouri fans are over the 0-19 season last year. Now, don't get me wrong. If you make me watch any footage from last season, I will certainly get some form of post-traumatic stress creeping into the back of my brain. But for me, for all of the people, and again, I think this is a minority at this point of Missouri basketball fans, I really do. But for the people who bring up the 0-19 as if no coach can ever come back from something like that, and certainly there's a lot of evidence to your point. Usually when a coach goes winless in conference play, the history isn't great for that. But I'm going to stick to what I thought was true last season, is that, well, a lot of that was fluky. It was just the year from Hades, basically, where every single thing went wrong. And that's not to excuse Dennis Gates entirely and say that he's blameless for what happened last season. But to me, I just think it would be one thing if that were the only data point that Missouri fans had. If that were Dennis Gates' first season at Missouri, to me that would cast a much longer and ominous shadow, in my opinion, that 0-19 season. But in fact, Missouri won 25 games Dennis Gates' first season, and quite surprisingly as well, with a couple of guys who were basically 6'8", 6'6" power forwards were your biggest starters, and some transfers from the Horizon League were your best players. And yeah, that all worked out to the tune of 25 wins. And not only that, really Cleveland State, his Dennis Gates' performance, his 3 seasons at Cleveland State, more impressive the more you dig into it, considering his first season, a really late start, hired almost when classes were about to start in August. Then his next 2 seasons, what happened? Well, they won the league. Again, under tough circumstances for Dennis Gates. So to me, while again, I'll nitpick Dennis when I think he's doing something wrong, I'm going to do that. I'm going to continue to do that on the program. When it comes to last season, sure, it's a data point. It's a weird data point. Certainly injuries contributed to it, some misevaluations by Gates and his staff as well. Sure, we can go with that too. But it's just one bad season. Unfortunately, if Missouri had picked up, 3 or 4 wins, there would have still been a horrible season. It just wouldn't have been historically horrible and has looked as bad on paper as it did. But to me, if I'm looking at 5 seasons of Dennis Gates as a head coach, as horrific as last year was, well, that's pretty obviously the outlier at this point. So I'm much more forgiving here and willing to look past that, considering all the other data points I have are pretty positive. This is a Missouri offense right now that is among the top 30 in the entire country. And while this is not a great defensive team by any stretch of the imagination, This is a much, much better defensive team than what Dennis Gates has had his first 2 years at Missouri. I think he's shown the ability to adjust, by the way, to multiple styles of basketball. This is a very different looking team than his first year at Missouri, and yet this team is also having a lot of success. So to me, the 0-19, let it go. There's no real reason to hold on to it at this point. Of course, we'll have to see how the rest of this season plays out. And of course, when it comes to nitpicks, here's an understandable one from listener Rick, who says, I don't like the fact that Missouri has long lapses and don't keep their foot on other teams' throats when they have them down. But a win is a win. So a positive take there at the end nonetheless. Indeed, a win is a win, but Missouri does definitely have a tendency to go through long stretches. It happened against Memphis, against Kansas, even in a victory, and to some extent in Missouri's last victory over Vanderbilt as well. But really, though, I don't know how much of that has to do with, quote unquote, stepping on other teams' throat. If you're referring to, just the eye of the tiger, effort, all that stuff, or is it more just simply the makeup of this team, which I just think at times, half-court offense-wise, I think Missouri's just going to struggle. They're just going to be caught in the mud on occasion because, well, without truly great shooting and spacing, occasionally your offense is going to be not great in the half court. I just think it's really as simple as that. I don't know if it's a matter of concentration and effort so much as it is just Missouri is a good offensive team, but they rely so much on getting to the free throw line. When that's not happening, well, they have a tendency to bog down a little bit. And everydayer JMF Bizzle on YouTube. Well, on the positive side, he loved the baby race. And frankly, the halftime baby race always is a winner, just in truly absurd fashion, as always. I have to agree here. But JMF Bizzle also had some questions about the Missouri rotation as well, asking if Peyton Marshall is injured. He was wearing sweats during the game on the bench. I didn't notice Marshall being not dressed out or anything like that. I think it's just simply that, well, he and Honor Boateng and Marcus Allen, T.O. Barrett, they haven't necessarily all earned the trust of the staff at this point, at least above, I would say, the solid core of 8 guys that Missouri played against Vanderbilt. Listener also asked if Gates is done with Aiden Shaw. He seems to have disappeared. Well, here's the thing. Missouri, again, played 8 guys. The guys that they started, plus Josh Gray, Marquez Warwick, and Caleb Grill. Plus Aiden Shaw got 2 minutes, Jacob Cruz, another 4. So Dennis Gates has done what I think I was asking in November, what a lot of Missouri fans were asking for in November, which is to tighten up the rotation. My whole thing was, hey, if this is an experimental period, fine. But come SEC season, you can't play 11 or 12 guys. Well, I think Dennis Gates is apparently keenly aware of that because that's exactly what he's done. He's pared it down to say 8 or 9 guys in most games. And Josh Gray, depending on how much you actually need a big guy, can get fewer than the 20 minutes he got in the previous game. Tony Perkins, who maybe coming off an illness or something like that, only got 12 minutes in the ball game as well. So really, Dennis Gates has done what people have asked. The problem is there's going to be a trade-off there. While Aiden Shaw does a lot of good things defensively for Missouri, I think offensively he's a tweener. He really is. Is he a center? Is he a power forward? Is he a small forward? He has traits really of all of those positions, but doesn't really fit into any of them exactly. And the real problem is he doesn't have a consistent jump shot, and he's really not big enough to actually be a true center or power forward type at this point, especially at center, more specifically. So I think that's where Aiden Shaw is. And as far as the Missouri freshmen go, well, when you have a roster with this many people on it, when you have players like Marquez Warwick and Jacob Cruz who aren't getting a ton of time but are Cruz in particular, but a guy like Marquez Warwick, who's a 4-year player, leading returning scorer in college basketball, yeah, Dennis Gates understandably is going to trust him more than he's going to trust even a ballyhooed freshman, somebody like Honor Boateng. So I think this all makes sense. It's just you do worry a little bit, hey, are these guys all bought in and patient with this, these guys being the freshmen? Because frankly, I don't want to see any of them transfer this offseason, but when you got 5 of those guys, what are the odds all 5 of them come back? Probably not super high. And in the playoff this past weekend, Ohio State actually showed a real loophole, I would say a flaw in the college football rule system at the end of the first half against Texas that I'm surprised more teams aren't taking advantage of. I really am. So let's talk about that here in just a minute. But first, from big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets. Guaranteed, that's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. Just visit the website and check out all the best lines out there, including, hey, the college football playoff is about to conclude here. The Ohio State Buckeyes, gosh, I can't pull it. Why am I struggling to pull this up right now? Great pod here, John. Well done. But I know that Ohio State is favored by, here we go, 8.5 over Notre Dame. I have to say I was a little surprised by how big that number is. And usually when a number surprises me like that, it's actually counterintuitive. In other words, go with the Buckeyes to cover. That's what I would say. But regardless, visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So if I'm Eli Drinkwitz or Corey Batoon, the Missouri defensive coordinator, I'm making a mental note if I'm watching that Texas-Ohio State game, because as the Longhorns were driving at the end of the first half, well, Ohio State committed a holding penalty, a defensive holding penalty, which is, of course, 5 yards and an automatic first down. Normally, that's a pretty big penalty, but with time dwindling in the first half, down and distance is not really much of a factor. In fact, if you're Ohio State, there's really no reason to not hold in that position. In fact, if I'm Missouri, I'm telling my players in that spot, let's say your opponent is backed up fairly far, behind midfield. They're not in field goal range by any means, but they're trying to get there. Hey, tell my defensive backs, man up with the 5 guys, the 5 legal receivers, and just tackle them. Just grab onto them. And yes, they'll throw the flag. It'll be 5 yards. And guess what? The half is going to eventually wind down. The clock is going to wind down. There really is no incentive, again, at the end of the first half to not do this. That's something that I think is a real loophole in the rules. And by the way, just a slight philosophical note to go out on here. I was thinking the other day, years and years ago when I was in high school, I remember my dad said one time that as a sports fan, at least, he would die a happy man if Missouri would just give him 1 national title in football and 1 national title in basketball. Well, unfortunately, it's been about 25 years, and we're still searching for both of those particular things. But fortunately, I'm also a Kansas City Chiefs fan, and I'll tell you this, I am not satisfied. I would like to complete the three-peat. And if the Chiefs have taught me anything, it's that nothing is never enough. I think I would have always thought, if I had never had the Chiefs in my life, I think I would have thought, you know what, if Mizzou just gets 1, then I'll be happy. I just don't think that's human nature, though. And when my uncle died about 2 years ago now, I remember at his celebration of life, one of our good family friends, Jim, was talking about how when he was a young man, his grandma had lived a very long and fruitful life well into her 90s, but he was still bummed out. You know, he wanted more. You know, again, that's human nature. No matter how good it is, he wanted more. Even though his grandma, a religious woman, in her words, she was ready to test her convictions. but Jim was not ready for that. That's what he was saying was his point. So even though she had lived a very long and great life by just about any historical standard, you know what? That's human nature, folks. It's never going to be enough. You're always going to want another day with your loved ones and all that good stuff, another win, another beer, another national championship, another Super Bowl, and all that good stuff. That is part of human nature. It's part of human nature, I think, that we have to fight, and it's a reminder that gratitude is something that is so important and so important to people's happiness. So I think that's one thing I learned about Missouri football in particular this past season is I really enjoyed the ride this season, even though Missouri came up a little bit short of its goals, of I guess even my goals, I guess. Hey, college football playoff. That's definitely what I wanted for Missouri this season. But despite the fact the Tigers didn't get there, despite the blowouts against Texas A&M and Alabama, the heartbreaker against South Carolina, well, there was a lot of great moments in this season. And even the heartbreaking moment, the game I attended in Columbia, South Carolina, well, it was a heck of a ride. I mean, it was an experience, wasn't it? I knew I was alive in that moment. The heartbreak, the ecstasy of the Luther Burden touchdown, one-handed catch. What a ball by Brady Cook on that play as well. Just so many great moments, and of course the bad ones as well. I think in life you just got to learn to enjoy the ride, enjoy the process, because if you don't, if you're always just looking for that high moment, well, those high moments, they're really fleeting. You got to learn to enjoy the ride, people. So hopefully I didn't get too waxy and philosophical there, but regardless, thanks for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. As always, thanks for making this show your first listen every day, and for your second listen, check out Locked On SEC. Be sure to subscribe. Going to be back on the squad this week. Had a great time with Chris and Zach and Luke last week. Can't wait to do it again this week. So until then, find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And I am John Miller, and thanks for listening to Locked On Mizzou.